Okay, so this lecture will focus on proportional representation and some of its variants. Um, Proportional representation is the electoral system most frequently used in Western Europe. Countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany to a limited extent, uh, all have proportional representation systems, as well as all the Scandinavian countries, I should add. How does list PR work? How do you fill seats in the legislature? Well, for one, you don't divide the country into districts like you do in first past the post. Instead, you basically have one big single national district. You ask each party that wants to run for office to draw up a list of candidates ordered from 1 to however many seats they want to fill. Once the parties have submitted their list of candidates, you ask the citizens to vote not for their favorite candidates, but for their favorite party, for their preferred list. That's why it's list PRs, because you're ultimately voting for a list, not for a specific candidate. Then, once everybody is voted, parties receive a number of seats in the legislature proportional to the percentage of the vote they received. So, for example, if they got 20% of the vote, 23% of the vote nationally, then they're going to get roughly 23% of the seats. And they fill those seats starting with candidate number 1 and then going to whatever number candidate gives them 23% of the legislature. Now, it's worth noting that most list PR countries have a threshold that parties must meet before anybody can be seated. And what this does is this prevents really tiny parties from messing things up. And by messing things up here, the principal worry is to have individuals with extreme preferences ultimately playing kingmaker between 2 or 3 larger parties. So what will happen is that those parties will need that 5 or 10% of the vote in order to get a legislative majority, which gives basically small minorities an extreme amount of leverage in the system. So to avoid the tiny minorities having a whole bunch of leverage, generally there's a threshold of 5 or 10%. Basically to prove that you're a serious party and not a complete joke, although of course in some cases you do have joke parties get seats in the legislature because they met the threshold, and in some cases the joke can be almost turned to something very serious. In Italy, a couple years ago, Beppe Grillo, who is a professional comedian who ran on a joke platform, came in a close third. His party came in a close third in Italian legislative elections, which really wasn't so much credit to him as the complete and utter disarray into which Italian politics fell in the 2000s. So, but again, typically that doesn't happen that much. What you will see, though, is you will see a much larger number of parties. And like I said in the last lecture, electoral systems affect party systems. Under PR systems, you have a lot more parties. So, like I said, PR systems often produce multi-party legislatures with no clear majority party. So how does anyone govern? Well, what parties have to do is negotiate amongst themselves to form a coalition government. Right, so the leaders of various parties will come together and try to make a deal. And what will then happen is that the deal will involve, say, the junior coalition member, that is to say the one that has the fewest, has fewer votes, will end up getting less important positions, and the majority coalition partner will generally have the prime ministership as well as some of the more important ministerial portfolios. In the case of single issue parties that do very well, often what happens is that those single issue parties pick the ministry that is concerned with their issue. So very typically, if the Green Party in France or in Germany is part of the winning coalition, they will want the Ministry for the Environment, maybe energy, if they do particularly well, because again, that is what their voters care about, and that is what they want to protect, and perhaps they care a little bit less about the other issues. A recent case in point, when the Liberal Party, the FDP in Germany, agreed to make a government with the Conservatives a few years back, the leader of the FDP became the foreign minister, which is a pretty important position within the European Union. And that was the price that FDP paid to be a junior coalition member with the Christian Conservatives. Like I said, the Prime Minister will usually come from the party with the most seats in the coalition. Now remember, when we talked about first past the post systems, we said that within each party, interest groups had to bargain. We said that, for example, within the Republican Party, economic business conservatives had to bargain with religious conservatives and libertarians in order to get a party platform together so that they could ultimately appeal to enough voters to have a chance at winning power. In list PR systems, in multi-party legislatures, the bargaining happens after the voting takes place, whereas in a list PR system, all the bargaining takes place during the primaries typically and at the convention. So you have both systems that have bargaining and have different interest groups, making deals in order to secure a distribution of power, but in the United States and in the UK, to a lesser extent, the deal making happens before the people go to the ballot box, and in the list PR systems, they happen after. And a lot of Americans think this is a point in favor of their system, of the first past the post system, because when voters go to the ballot box in, say, Sweden, for instance, they can certainly select the party that represents their interests better, but they have no control over what the bargains will end up being like, or they have very limited control over what kind of ultimate arrangements are going to be made between their party and ruling party and other parties. Whereas in the United States, since the bargain is already presented to the voters when they go to the ballot box, and so they know exactly what the deal is, what kind of bargain has been struck, and so in theory, what kind of policies will come into play. Although in the United States, it's more complicated because the president and the legislature can come from different parties, and that can throw a wrench into the system. This doesn't happen in the UK. So let's talk about some slight variations within list PR. There's closed list PR, which is what I just described, and then there's open list PR. Now, under open list PR, parties also submit a long list of candidates, but voters vote for their favorite candidate, not for their favorite list. And the party still gets a number of seats proportional to its vote total, but instead of the list being created by the party, which gives them a lot of leverage, the list is created by the voters about which candidates were most popular, and what that does is that it removes some of the control, the agenda setting control of the party. This has both good and bad effects. You could argue that it's good because unpopular people of a majority party don't get into office, and that's more democratic in a sense. On the other hand, what it means is that it's more of a popularity contest on the one hand, and second, the issue becomes that party leaders have a hard time enforcing discipline within their parliament, so the people all vote the party line, because of course in a system of closed list PR, party leaders can say, you know what, we don't like you, you're off the list, or we don't like you, we're putting you down on the list, making you less likely to be able to get a seat. And so party leaders can reward and punish people who are loyal to the party, making politics a little bit more cohesive, so that when a party makes a deal, backbenchers in the party don't renege on the deal and decide to go do their own thing, but that they can enforce the deal, and ultimately their bargaining is credible. Slight variations, closed list and open list. So in closed list, like I said, parties are stronger. Party organizations and leaders are stronger. And it's also worth noting that on a closed list PR system, it's possible to ensure that a certain percentage of women or minorities are present in the legislature by mandating that they be present on the list in specific spots. So what this does is that you can in some ways gerrymander or engineer certain kinds of social representation to make sure that women are adequately represented, to make sure that minorities are adequately represented. And this is in fact what you see in the legislatures of countries that have PR systems, is that you see the percentage of women in the legislatures is much higher. So for instance, in Iceland, women are slightly over 50% of parliamentarians. In the United States, it's only about 17. Right? So that tells you that one of these systems is much more favorable to the representation of genders and minorities. Now, not everybody necessarily thinks that that is a good thing or that's the right thing to do, but it's something you can do in a closed list system that you cannot do in an open list system or in a first-past-the-post system. In a first-past-the-post system, if you are an unpopular minority that's a minority in every district, you will win no seats. Even if you're 10, 15, 20% of the population, doesn't matter. You still have to win a seat. You're unpopular. You can't win a district, so you don't win a seat. Okay. So in comparison, PR and FPTP. PR can ensure that women and minorities are represented. FPTP can help minorities if they are willing to gerrymander minority districts, but they can't really help women. So if there are districts where you have concentrations of minorities, you can gerrymander the district to make sure that there are a certain number of, say, black seats in Congress, which is exactly what the United States Congress has done. To make sure, in other words, that you have districts that are overwhelmingly populated with African American voters, and what that does is that it creates certain safe seats for African Americans, whereas if African Americans were distributed proportionally to their 13% of the population ratio, they would probably get no seats, or they would be at risk of getting no seats. In PR systems, spread out minorities are going to certainly be better represented. So environmentalists and communists and other sort of minority preferences are going to be represented much better, because at the end of the day, if you're 5% of the vote or 10% of the vote, you can get some seats usually. Whereas if you're 5 to 10% of the vote in the United States or in the UK, you get no seats whatsoever because you can't win a district. So in first-past-the-post systems, on the other hand, concentrated minorities can be represented, but those that are geographically dispersed can't. Another surprising effect, perhaps, of electoral systems is the type of issue that comes up in Congress or in the legislature. In PR systems, national issues that affect everyone are much more salient than regional issues. And the reason is simple. You can't really win much in the way of voting by favoring one region over another, or by investing your political capital over the development of one region over another in a PR system, because ultimately you're accountable to the entire electorate. So you have to appeal to issues that appeal to the entire electorate. You can't do as much in terms of favoring specific regions, whereas in first-past-the-post systems, local issues are often more likely. After all, if you think about a congressman in the United States, congressman in the United States is dependent solely on his or her district for re-election. Whether people like him or her in another district is completely irrelevant to his or her electoral chances. And so at the end of the day, what you see in the United States is lots of local issues come up at the national level, and particularly in the case of powerful committee members and committee chairs, they can direct a fair amount of spending to their own districts at the expense of other districts, because that will improve their re-election chances, something that you can't do if you don't have a district. So having a district means, on the upside, that constituents can be very well served, and that there's a kind of constituent service relationship in first-past-the-post systems that doesn't exist in PR systems. Some people like that in the sense that it means that there's somebody looking out for your specific geographic interests at the national level. On the other hand, that's not so good, because a lot of things that could be dealt with locally end up wasting the time of the national legislature on issues that, 80 to 90% of the country doesn't care about. One slight variation on on PR systems is something called mixed member proportional systems, also called semi-proportional systems. This is a system that exists in Germany and Japan in slightly different formats. But basically what happens is that the country is going to be divided into districts, and half the legislature, so half the seats in Congress or the legislature, in Germany would be the Bundestag, half the seats are filled through first-past-the-post voting. So half of your members are district reps. The other half of the reps are elected through proportional representation. which means that effectively when you go to the ballot box in Germany, you have two votes. You have a vote for your local representative who goes to Congress, and you have a vote for a party. You can vote for a local representative who's of that party, or you can split your vote. But the notion is that you want national issues to come to the fore, and you have to have some people caring about national issues, namely the parties, but you also have to have some degree of concern for local issues at the national level, and so there's this compromise of semi-proportional systems, which literally, cuts the baby in half, so to speak. So some mixed member proportional systems, mixed systems like Germany, compensate for disproportionality in the district reps by compensating parties that did not win districts outright with extra seats from their lists, which makes the overall legislature more proportional. So for example, let's say that you're the FDP in Germany, the Liberal Party, and you won a very respectable 15% of the vote. Now, with 15% of the vote, it's possible that you didn't win any districts. So you have no district reps, but you've got 15% of the vote. So what's going to end up happening is you're going to get 30% of the proportional representation seats, such that you get 15% of seats in the legislature. You'll have no district reps, but you'll be overrepresented on the other side of the legislature, because at the end of the day, the German system is trying to make the system proportional. Which means that if you are a Christian Democratic candidate and or you're a Christian Democratic Party and you won half or more of the districts, you may see some of your seats fritter away, even if you won, 35 or 40% of the national vote, because you won't get 35 or 40% of the other half of the legislature. You'll get much less than that, but you will get 35 to 40% of the total seats in the legislature. Okay, there are other mixed systems, though, that don't compensate in this way. And those systems are much more disproportional. They look a lot more like the United States and the United Kingdom than they look like Sweden or Denmark. So these systems, like Japan after its 1993 electoral reform, have the same system as Germany, but they don't compensate, which means that small parties are represented but are much smaller. And they're represented in a much smaller proportion than their aggregate vote totals in some cases might suggest. Well, assuming they can't win any districts. Okay, so that's all for our discussion of proportional representation and mixed systems. The key points to hold from here, key points to remember from this: the type of electoral system matters, so how the votes are counted matters, and it matters in very specific ways. It matters as to where the bargains are struck, at what level the bargains are struck, what kinds of issues end up coming up, and the degree to which the degree to which members of parliament do any constituent service or not.